Welcome to Earth, a Love Story. I'm your host, Robin Lassiter. On this episode of the podcast, I talk to author Mike Fiorito. Mike has written several books, including the hated ones, Falling from Trees, Sleeping with Fishes, Call Me Guido, Freud's Haberdashery Habits, Hallucinating Huxley, and his latest book, Mescalito Riding His White Horse, inspired by the music of bluegrass legend Peter Rowan. He has a novel in production slated to come out in 2024 called For All We Know, which examines the phenomena and the liminality that always seems to be associated with it. I saw Mike's book, Mescalito Riding His White Horse, pop up on my Instagram feed, and the name and cover caught my eye. I didn't know anything about Mike, or Peter Rowan for that matter, but I kept feeling drawn to reach out. I know better at this point than to ignore those little sparks of connection. When I did reach out, I discovered that we inhabit unexpected overlapping landscapes, including Tibetan Buddhism, wisdom traditions, ufology, profound dreams and visions, and a fascination with the phenomena. Mike sent me a copy of Mescalito, and when I began reading, I was astonished at the flurry of synchronicities that emerged in the very first paragraph. Those of you who have listened to or read my book will probably catch them right away. Here is a brief excerpt from Mescalito Riding His White Horse by Mike Fiorito. Vision of the Dalai Lama. Before I began writing this book, I had a vision that I was visited by the Dalai Lama. Unlike the Dalai Lama I'd seen on television and in media images, this one wore a crown of jewels. He was enveloped in a dome of rainbows. He was bedecked in a bright red robe, studded with sparkling rubies and diamonds. He held, in one of his 8 hands, a white spotted red umbrella that looked like a mushroom. The scent of sandalwood filled the air around him. The Dalai Lama gestured towards me, his eyes opening wide. Our eyes met. When you look at your 10-year-old son, Travis, do you see every single moment of his being? His eyebrows arched while he spoke. I was surprised he knew my son's name. What do you mean? I asked. Which version of him is true? He replied, holding his hands in a prayer. When he stopped speaking, I noticed he was reciting a prayer to himself. He had a slight smile on his face. When I didn't speak, he clarified. Is it the moment he was born, or his present state of being 10? Or is he always becoming? Like when you look at any object, are you seeing every instance, every permutation of that object? Take, for example, when you look at your wife's wedding ring, do you see the millions of years it took to create the diamonds? Or do you see the history of the white gold on her ring? How the gold was mined from the ground, how it was separated from the other sediments? Do you imagine the instruments used, the labor it took, the life of each worker from birth to death? How it was transported from one location to another? Do you see the gold or the diamond at the atomic level, or, going smaller, at the subatomic level? Which version of the ring do you see, or do you see them all? I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, thinking about the onslaught of questions. As I contemplated his queries, the Dalai Lama's face morphed into my mother's face. This made me soften. He smiled my mother's smile. Her skin was young, unwrinkled. She was happy. I had forgotten how much I had missed that smile. Her smile said, I'm looking out for you. I love you and will always put you first. I felt her love wash over me. I so enjoyed this conversation with Mike, and I hope you do too.
We drove across the country. She was going to move to Berkeley. And we drove across the country. When we got to Colorado, it was just so beautiful. We were both city. She was more, she'd gone to school at Tufts, and she, in
Mm.
general, just knew more about outdoor life stuff. I was a kind of a klutz. I couldn't, set up a tent. I couldn't do anything, which was kind of humbling. But when we got to Colorado, just the beautiful array of trees and the pine trees and the vistas and the sweeping,
Mm.
the hugeness of it all. And when we left Colorado, just before we left, we both got out of the ground and kissed the ground, the
Oh,
highway. But it
wow.
was just such a perfect, beautiful, I hadn't, I hadn't been to Colorado until then. And so for my eyes, in my consciousness, it just was, in New York City, you don't see, you have big buildings all over. You don't get to see these sweeping vistas unless you go to edge places like the ocean, or we're near the ocean. I'm actually not too far from Coney Island, so you get to see, you're looking out into the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So that was just special. I thought I'd let you know. But
Yeah.
where in Colorado are you?
Thank you. I'm right on the southern border. Nearest town is a tiny little town called Trinidad, and it's on the
Mm,
New Mexico border,
okay.
about 4 hours south of Denver, really the middle of nowhere, kind of between Denver and Santa Fe. And it's just at the edge of the Front Range and the foothills. So at about 7,200 feet, ponderosa pine forests. And I've
Hmm.
traveled and lived a bunch of different places. I've moved 32 times in my life, which is
Wow.
ridiculous. And I I know what you mean about like the space and the skies
Yeah.
here. And I grew up here, so it's home, but there's also New Mexico is this way for me too. Just the Southwest, anywhere that you can get a blue sky and
Mm,
see for a long way does
yeah.
something good for my soul. So yeah, I
Yeah.
hear
And
you.
I think if I'm right, I don't remember, but I think it was the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, right
That's
in
right.
New Mexico and they kind of, it gets bigger and bigger. And here we were two kind of city people, 22 years old, and off on an adventure. We took about a
Mm,
month, and it was great. We weren't really boyfriend and girlfriend. And then she stayed in Berkeley, and then I actually came out to live in Oakland, which is near Berkeley. I lived there for a couple of years, just to, when I saw it at that time and the things that were going on, and
mm,
the art culture and the music scene, it just drew me. And it was very young. It was very
mm,
young and hippie. It was still in the air. It was just a great experience. I'm really glad I did that. I just
mm.
dropped everything and went to Berkeley, you know.
Yeah, I love it. I've done that so many times in my life, and it's always, I mean, usually I'm running from something. Like that's my stories. I'm like, I got to get out of here. I'm gonna burn it all down and run away in the
Right,
night.
right.
But it's still there is still something to that, like seeing different places, being around, being in different environments, and seeing what it brings up. And I can't imagine like
Hmm.
at that time being near Berkeley and the electricity in the air of what was happening in the world. Yeah, I kind of weirdly long for those days, sort of a counterculture
Mm.
edge that is different now. I mean, I think it still exists now, but everything is so compartmentalized. A lot more, um, there are a lot of bubbles and a lot of edges,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
it's really hard to have a sense of something kind of unified happening. And I really long for that.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think what I'm digging is some of the that you and I are involved in, some of the
Mm-hmm.
intellectual art culture, um, the culture of the phenomena, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
But books like Deep Weird,
Mm-hmm.
that Jack Hunter edited, and bringing together all of these interesting people that are looking at the phenomena from the eco perspective, from a kind of psychedelic perspective, from an alchemical perspective, uh, bridging ufology with the paranormal and fairy lore, and these kind of all of these kind of compartmentalized things coming together, and we're speaking to each other, which is I just find it's very inviting, and it's inspiring. And I should say that, I can't say that I've been deeply into, the phenomena and the subject matter for an extremely long time. I would say that I've always been interested in, Jung and kind of his alchemy books. It always drew me, these kinds of things. And I shared some dreams with you that I had, but I often have apocalyptic dreams, and I dream of UFO scenarios a lot, and then recently as well. It's an interesting how this all got started for me. Curious to hear for you as well. But I had written a book, so I'd written a book called Falling from Trees. I don't know if it's blurred out.
It is,
Falling
but I've
from Trees.
I did take a look at that. Yeah, it's a beautiful cover.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, the woman that did the cover, she, if I have a manuscript accepted, I'll ask the publisher, can I recommend an artist? So she's done a number of book covers. But this book is there's very short stories, and they're explorations of consciousness, of the future of consciousness, of evolution, human evolution, the evolution of sentience. Some of them are doubtful, some of them are hopeful. So there's a kind of playing with putting science in its place. I mean, I'm a very scientific thinking person, but I also know that science has to be contexted. It is still, there are sociological factors of, what constitutes good science at what time, and what are the inputs. So these were things in my mind. But anyway, I wrote this book, and then I think I picked up The Flip by Jeff Kripal.
Yeah.
I just picked it up, and I just was like, oh shit, wow. And I felt like I'd read his book before I'd written mine. And I wrote to Jeff, and he and I started to correspond. And another example of is, if you know Anthony Peake, he's written a number of books, UK based. He wrote a book called The Hidden Universe. So I was reading his book, and I said, and a similar thing. It felt like I'm reading passages that helped me to write the book that I'm writing. And it's funny because when Anthony and I were having some conversation over Teams, I think, Facebook, and he said, I just put your book down, and I've been taking this train in the UK, and the stop that I get off of to visit my whomever is called the Three Bridges. And he goes, and I just turned to the page in your book, the story that is the Three Bridges. And there were these kind of synchronicities, happening. If you look, they're there. I mean, I heard you're talking to Mike Cleland, and, if you're looking, if you're paying attention, like Mike said, maybe, people will think you're crazy. But if you're paying attention, there are things that are kind of surfacing. This all kind of launched me into, gosh, I probably read, 40 books on the subject in the past something. So it's in the past 2.5 years, let's say, and it's colored all of my writing and thinking. But that's kind of how it happened to me. In other words, it pulled me in, my own writing. It's like I mailed a postcard to myself, and it's not a bullshit thing. It's some odd time loop. And in fact, I feel a lot of my writing feels like that. It feels like the older me looked back to the younger me, and there was some communication between those two beings. And I have a book called The Hated Ones, which is kind of rough and tumble stories of New York City in the 70s, early 80s. It's not for everyone. It's a pretty raw book. I would never have thought when I was that age at that time that it would become a book. But there's some uncanny connection. There's some time loop aspect of me writing those stories as they're happening. but sending them to me later. So have you had that kind of, do you feel that kind of connection in your work and in your artistic work?
Yeah, I mean, first, I just want to say thank you for all of that. I'm feeling connection to everything that you brought forward, and to that, I'm getting chills. It's like, yeah, speaking my language. And just to touch on quickly what you said about the phenomena and like the conversations around it being this edge of real, it feels kind of revolutionary. It feels pretty amazing what's happening. And
Mm-hmm.
it's at that place where it feels really pure as well. It's just a lot of discovery and a lot of exciting things going on. And I also was drawn into this in the last, like I've had a lifetime of experiences. Sounds like you have too from what I've read, but never contextualized in that. Like I didn't know ufology was a thing. I didn't know that it
Mm-hmm.
was taken seriously. I didn't know that there was all of this really beautiful, deep thought around all of it. And
Agreed.
so when I discovered that, I was like, oh, holy shit. And it started putting all these pieces together for me too. And then there were really overt, you know, seeing craft, having,
Mm-hmm.
dreams from childhood, but I didn't have any context or framework for it. And through all of this, it's like the framework has arrived and
Mm-hmm.
just changed everything through like an initiation process that wasn't terribly
Mm-hmm.
comfortable and isn't always
Mm-hmm.
comfortable, but like really powerful and orienting my whole life, So, and then the time loop stuff, like, yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I've had absolute direct experience where I've touched into my past. And so I've had it from this side, kind of from like the future touching into the past, and sort of healed and rescued an aspect of self that was stuck at a
Mm-hmm.
trauma point in the past. But not in a psychology way, in a very visceral, real kind of journeying way. And when I
Mm-hmm.
realized that that happened and realized that that was happening, I started practicing sending my past self
Mm-hmm.
messages and
Interesting.
care,
Yeah.
right? So sort of from the other side of it, but like, oh wow, if what you're saying is true, that time is more
Yeah.
slippery than we think, then that's possible. Then maybe, me doing it now helped me get through some really difficult things in my past. So, and I think of
Yeah.
Eric Wargo's book, Time Loops. I don't know if you've read
Right.
that, but yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Big
yeah,
tome.
it is. Yeah. So yeah, all of that, it's amazing how it all weaves together, and it's exciting. It's really
Yeah.
exciting.
And when I read, because you sent me Earth Love Story, and I listened to the podcast. I mean, you have a great voice,
Thanks.
and you have a great voice, and the production is great.
Mm,
So it's exciting to listen to. It was really, but especially what I have written, which you have not, read.
mm-hmm,
Just this kind of what you're playing with, these notions of I am of the earth, that
mm,
I am fundamentally, I am made up of the earth. We
mm,
are, continuous. It even goes beyond that, but this very, you really zero in on earth and on the soil and on the local, soil of where you are growing up and being raised to be respectful and aware. I was not. So I grew up in the city. I grew up really in Queens, which is a borough, outside of Manhattan. But we just didn't have, we had trees that were, in little squares. But I so much related to those parts of your book that you have these revelatory experiences of, and this ancestral thread that
mm,
goes back, and it mixes in with maybe not some bad people, some good people. There's,
mm-hmm,
like we all have,
mm-hmm.
all human lives.
Yeah.
But it really, as I was reading that book, and I think there's something that's happening. There's a zeitgeist of shared You said framework. I think that's a great word. I think Jeff Kripal has provided a framework to make this conversation sober, open to curiosity, and he's just given us a means to have this conversation in a way that, probably most people are uncomfortable having the conversation. I understand why.
Yeah.
I understand why, but I also understand, it also seems to me, okay, let's put aside UFOs. You don't believe in them or whatever. We live in an 18 billion year old universe. We think it's about that old. We live on a roughly 4.5 billion year old planet. As far as we could see, there are galaxies with billions of stars, for as far as we can see with our telescopes. And you think that going to work and coming home and getting your shopping and going on Amazon and buying your this and the best shoes, that you think that rounds it all out? I mean, it's a big mystery. And I think that's what Jeff has kind of helped to bring it back into focus, that we are just exploring. We're exploring the unknown. There's data that, there's people's experiences, eyewitness experiences, and there's also data that doesn't fit with the, I guess, the kind of the standard notions of time, of human existence. But I'm super excited that we have a community of people, and people do interact. I mean, people will write back. You and I have become friends through just writing and shared interests. Mostly people are pretty friendly, I think, in this space. You do have some fringe stuff where there's fights over squabbles over certain things, and I'm not interested in that. I'm not interested in the squabble over crash retrieval stuff. I'm not interested in that. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
And the deep layers of government. Yeah, the government's lying to you all the time, of course.
Right.
I mean, your water is poisoned, the soil is poisoned. We eat food that's, and you're sold all of this stuff as, it's the way it is. So it's not too hard to believe. It's not a big conspiracy thing. It's just, they're full of shit.
Right.
We're products. We're products for a GDP.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah. No, I agree. All of that. I wonder if, as you were talking about the connection to the earth and that connection to kind of lineage and being of the earth, I came to that through always feeling like I wasn't. Even though I was so deeply connected to the planet as a child, I don't know if you can hear it, but the thunder is rolling and it's just like,
I don't hear it.
Oh, bummer. Yeah. It's really beautiful here right now. There's storms rolling in. So
it's perfect as we're discussing this. Right?
It is. Yeah, exactly.
Like Frank, Mary Shelley,
Right. Very much so. Yeah. Yeah. So even though I was very, very connected to nature, incredibly like woven into it, that was my entire reality. I always felt like that I didn't belong here, that I was other. And it took me a really long time to come to terms with the idea that I might not incarnate on Earth as often as I incarnate other places. Like that was, a really, really difficult thing for me to come to terms with partially because of like how cringe it's all become, because it's all star seeds and it's just, that's what I came up in. And I developed just a big allergy to that. But I've had so many personal experiences that I feel connected to somewhere else. And I consciously made the decision to align myself with existence and the planet and not with somewhere far away that I would go to at the end of my life and not be connected here. Like I was like, I'm going to be here with this because this is extraordinary. And so I wonder, as you were talking about that, did you have that sense, or have you always felt like super at home here, or what's it been like for you?
So I think that's a great question, and it's an interesting one. I think I've always been space looking. I've always been
Mm.
looking up, and I've always been looking up and out. When COVID happened, suddenly we were quarantined, and I live in a pretty small apartment, and but we started to take walks. So
Mm.
there's, believe it or not, it's Brooklyn, but you have tree-lined streets. You have gardens. You have a tremendous bird population here.
Mm.
There's a park not too far from where I live, and there's also a train track there's a train that runs north and south, and there's one that runs east-west. That's a freight train, but there's a long bower that goes all the way out to, I think, Queens or Long Island. But it brings a lot of wildlife, raccoons and so on. So one of the things that occurred to me was I started to look up at the birds and the trees.
Mm.
And I read a book, The Genius of Birds, and I read a few books by Ackerman. Her last name is
Mm.
great writer. I started to pay attention to these things. There's a book called Sweetgrass that I read at that time as well. I started to pay attention to trees. I
Mhm.
started to observe these things as being alive, and not just,
Mm.
sadly, I would say, oh, that's a tree. I didn't know, like, how do you identify an oak?
Mhm.
My wife said, it's the leaf. You look at the leaf. I was like, duh, okay. But my wife grew up in Long Island, which is a little bit more, it's a little bit more rural. You're still close to the city, but she has a much greater knowledge of bird types and tree types and plant types. But during COVID, you had these little trips. We'd take trips, and I became more interested. I mean, I'd always been theoretically interested in nature, but
Mm.
God forbid my toes are going to be exposed to the wet mud and,
Mm.
you know, all of this kind of thing. I'm kind of a wuss in that respect. I mean, I think I've gotten, I'm willing and I want to be there, but to come back to that one thing, that what has occurred to me is that the earth is space. We are
Mm.
also space. This is outer space right
Mhm.
here, all of this. And as I explored in the book Mescalito Riding His White Horse, I kind of went into this, Buddhist metaphysics. But it's all of what we see is, and science kind of confirms this, is provisional frameworks.
Mm.
And a lot of it is how we wrap our consciousness around what it is we see. What would it look like or be like if we weren't here? It's interesting that quantum mechanics is telling us, well, when we observe, we impact the outcome. And it's as if, consciousness is, and we don't understand it, but consciousness is a part of this relationship, this negotiation. But to get back to what you said, I've kind of come to the conclusion there are kind of levels of, there's interstellar, there's the kind of whole metaphysics and framework of, cosmos, and Earth is another instance of that. And all of
Mm.
this interconnection between, soil and between mycorrhizal, web of in the soil and the trees, and this elaborate web of life. That these are all continuous things. And my mother passed a year ago, and there was something about coming close to that border place of life and death, where you feel that continuity
Mm.
of, from earth to soil to food to body to life to death to earth to soil, in
Mm.
this kind of circular loop. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I have to say, for me, like, I've always been, yeah, I love nature. I love nature. Oh, we're gonna go camping. Okay. Okay. Is there a place nearby we can stay? You know, I mean, ironically, when I was younger, I was 22, we went on this as I mentioned at the outset, we went on this great trip around the country. I was 22. I mean, I could sleep on anything. My guts were pressed up against rocks and didn't give a shit, man. I slept beautifully. I didn't have to pee all night, none of these older person things that happen now. And I was open to all of, we went to the Vortex in Sedona. We went to these places, and I just kind of had a openness to it. I can't say that I was a firm believer at that time. I just was open to what was happening. So, nature is something for me it's a friend that I try to get to know better. And, maybe sometimes she wears clothes that are a little rough to the skin and the touch. But I really want to, it's very close to me in many ways, but just not I'm not a natural, when we've gone camping, my wife is always smarter about the details and knows more about it, which is humbling, but it's true. So if that answers your question.
Yeah. Thank you. As you're talking about noticing the birds and noticing the trees, and also my mind is just kind of being swept away by this description of sort of the multidimensionality of things, that we are part of the cosmos, and that there are sort of these spheres of awareness, and it all has to do with consciousness, and we don't really understand it at all. Yeah, I have this theory that that part of whatever's going on right now in the midst of all the messiness and everything that's happening, which is, a lot of really challenging things, but part of what's happening is we sort of, our emotional bodies are coming online. Where all of a sudden a lot of folks are aware that they have physical bodies. Like, what does it mean to be embodied? We're kind of moving out of the headspace a little bit and down into our bodies a bit more. And as a result of that, we're realizing that, I will speak for myself. I realized that I just looked around and was like, oh, holy shit. Like, I'm a body on a planet, and this is a relational place. Like you were talking about, this web of existence. And then realizing that I think that humans have been very aware of all of that for a really long time. And it's only been relatively recently that we've kind of forgotten and moved away from it. But what you're describing as you're walking down the street and seeing birds and trees is, for me, this idea of animacy. Like, it's all alive. It's all inhabited by something. And if that, when that realization happens, everything changed, and everything changes. It's like, now it is about relationship. So I love that description as well. It's like a friend you're trying to get to know, because it suddenly all becomes relational, which is just this massive gift. And we just don't know how to do it. We're not great at it. We're not great at remembering that it's a big relational web. But when it comes online, it's like, oh, this is what Joseph Campbell has this quote about the rapture of being alive. Like, we're not looking for the meaning of life so much as the experience, like remembering the rapture of being alive. And that's kind of what I experienced, was this rapture.
Right. Like the timeless realm you were discussing with Mike Clellan. And you have those moments, and it's funny. I think that it's interesting because you're hearing now in the news, you're hearing information, UFO information, and it's befuddling, and you're not exactly sure why is it being allowed now. And you can go down a whole rat hole of a conspiracy theory, and I'm not interested in that. But, there's so much intelligence around us. You mentioned birds, and man, when you really listen to birds, you go, that is so, there's some mathematical, there's something that's being said here. I don't know what it is. You look at the interaction of, I read the book, Entangled, by Merlin Sheldrake. Great book. And he has a PhD. I think he studied fungi. He has a degree in, kind of studying the various manifestations and of fungi, if I'm saying it right. But just all of this intelligence that mycorrhiza has to navigate spaces, closed spaces, to kind of create this interconnection, being able to pass chemicals from a soil to the tree, to provide communication. And here we are, as human beings, and we do have this extraordinary technological, we have this, we have, it appears that we have something different, but it also, it blocks us from seeing all of what's around us. And you had said something like coming to this awareness of, awakening to this. In the word Buddha means, from Sanskrit, awake. Aldous Huxley has in his book Island, I think it opens up with like awake, awake, awake. It's a great book, as Aldous Huxley can do. It's this compendium of different philosophies, and he could bring so much knowledge into his writing. A perennial philosophy. He's drawing from all these wisdom traditions. And I think, of course, this is why they're not necessarily coming down right to us directly, and because they're waiting for us to become conscious, to become awake, to see what we're doing to the planet and to each other.
Yeah.
The horrible greed that runs most of the show on this planet among people. Maybe I'm a starry-eyed hopeful, but I think the data is mounting against us. And that's the question, and we just don't know. Well, will we awake? Could that ever happen? Why do I have these apocalyptic dreams? I had that dream I told you about, where these UFOs that looked like the lamp light, halogen lamp lights, and they kind of glowed. And there was this long like caravan of things, of objects. One of them was a tree lying on its side. And it was that dream, it worked its way into my manuscript.
Yeah.
It was just too important. And I feel like it connects up what we've been talking about, the cosmological with the terrestrial. As above, so below. It's funny how these things come back. But I do feel, will we ever get to that place? I inexplicable.
Yeah. I'm a starry-eyed hopeful as well. So I'm with you. I really am.
Yeah.
One of the things that I came to was that I really love humanity. I do. I know how problematic it all is. I know all of the cruelty and everything that can exist. I know that we're far, far from perfect, but I really have a lot of faith in humanity. I really do. I think that we're creators, we're artists in whatever we do. And I'm very hopeful about that. And, as you're talking, I'm thinking like what you were kind of saying at the beginning, which is how do all of these different seemingly separate things entwine? But we've talked about spirituality, UFOs, death, the passing of your mother. I'm so sorry that she passed a year ago.
Thank you.
Time loops, the terrestrial, like there does seem to be something that is bringing all of these threads together to help us uncover some really deep mystery. And the phenomenon is seemingly almost intentionally tricky. Like as soon as you kind of wrap your head around what it should be, it transforms into something else. And there's all the ideas like, is this a developmental driver? Is it like a control mechanism?
Right.
We don't know. You're right. We don't know. But what it's doing is, one of the things it's doing is getting us away from thinking that we're the top of the food chain, that we're sort of the pinnacle of something, and putting us into a cosmology, which is humbling. And then necessarily, like, we, for some reason, haven't quite figured out that connection to the earth for our very survival is incredibly important, right? That we rely on her for food and resources and literally everything. Suddenly, when we're not at the top of, when we're not at the pinnacle, all of it comes into a different perspective. And I agree
Hmm.
with you. Why the Armageddon dreams? And I've made a distinction for a while now, but I've been thinking about it lately between Armageddon and apocalypse, right? Because apocalypse is this kind of unveiling, this revealing of something. Armageddon is just,
Hmm.
you know, bad shit happening,
Shit going down.
shit going down. And mine have been Armageddon dreams. It's been like,
Wow.
yeah, destruction and
Mm.
bombs and suffering and suffering and
Mm.
suffering, and seeing that happen, and then this big mission, this big directive, like, you need to do something about this. And me,
Hmm.
I'm 5 or I'm 7 or I'm 12 or I'm 20 or I'm, they continue to happen. And so what do we do with that? And how is the phenomena involved in that? And why is it such a common thing for experiencers to have? And also the
Hmm.
UFO dreams. Like, I haven't
Hmm.
had them in a while, but they've been coming back. And for me, there's always elation. It's like,
Hmm.
there they are. I knew they were real. There they are. And I'm going to show
Yes.
everybody. And I've had sightings which didn't have that
Mm.
elation, but the dreams always do. Yeah, it's coming up right up against the edge of the mystery and of the
Yeah.
mystical. Like, what the hell is this? And also acknowledging that there are cultures that much more readily accept all of these parts and
Hmm.
pieces as reality. And that we, again, have just sort of moved away from it, so that it's astonishing to realize that the world isn't,
Hmm.
reductionist materialism, but there are a lot of places that are like, yeah, you feed the spirits,
Hmm.
you make offerings, you tend to your land, you tend to the spirits of place for real, or bad shit happens. Like, we are in a
Yeah.
web.
Yeah. Exactly. And the I started, so I wrote for a newspaper, local newspaper, and there's an art studio a good friend of mine has, and he's Guatemalan, and he
Mm,
does these incredible. He does cutouts of MTA, New York City cards, train cards, and then he makes
mm,
these gorgeous portraits, these beautiful and landscapes, and he's done stuff for the Audubon Society. Well, one of the friends that comes to that studio is a chief, a Taino chief, a local Taino chief. He has a place upstate that he has ceremonies, and he has a community.
mhm,
He's from the Bronx originally, and anyway, after I met, we kind of, I just happened to be at the studio and we had a conversation, and he blew my fucking mind
mm,
with all of this other way of thinking,
mm,
of
mhm,
connection to earth, and but they do practical things. They have a garden, and it's also, they open the community up to people of any indigenous background and people not,
mhm,
and people who have some type of maybe they've had problems with alcohol or PTSD, and they come and they work in the garden, and they learn the practices. Is it the Three Sisters
mm, mhm,
practice of planting? And this inspired me then to go, and I started to read books, various. This is a gigantic subject. Read books on indigenous culture and specific indigenous cultures. I started to reach out to people to do interviews with them,
mhm,
which is tricky, because why would they want to talk to me? They didn't even know me. Some people were introduced, but it led me down this whole. I think I did about 13 interviews and
mm,
published many of them, most of them, for a local newspaper. But it was part of my journey in. I come back to the writing. The writing has takes me to places. It's a passport to talk to people. I can ask you deep questions that maybe you wouldn't just ask someone at a
mhm,
party or some other context. And it was an education for me. But the idea that you are one connected to the earth. You have respect for the earth. In braiding sweetgrass, we learn about practices that would be shunned by the scientific community, but actually have credibility, and they're more longer term thinking. And that's where we look at the month, the quarter.
Mm-hmm.
This is what, especially Americans, so consumer focused. But there is this. There have been traditions, in our own soil,
Mm-hmm.
where we now occupy. I think it was Crazy Horse that said it's going to take some generations, and then your people are going to look back to our people, and your people are going to need our people. And, these practices of ecological awareness are becoming very important. There are ecology and conservation organizations that are partnering with indigenous folks around the country to bring together forces to revive the land, to make the water healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, this is all at odds with what's going on in the country and the politics, and you hear all this stuff, and you think, my God, this is such bullshit. This is such lies, that's being, put upon us. But like you said, the answers, these ideas are not new. In Western culture, we've had these ideas in European culture, different traditions. The technological revolution and scientific revolution have made us sort of disconnected us from folk traditions and from kind of common sense things that we follow and believe. And this disconnection from, the brain is just a machine, your mind is an illusion. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that we're building, these constructs of illusory notions. This is always happening. But when I pinch you, it hurts.
Mm-hmm.
When I kick you, it hurts. There are things that are real. There are things that are real. And it's real. It's provisional, but it's real. And I don't know if it's a test. I don't know. I think consciousness, like you said, part of the problem is the trickster nature of it all. But consciousness is looking at itself. How does it do that? That's part of it. It's a mirror, or it's something or unconscious is in the way. So I don't think there's any easy answer to that. But even the quantum world is tricky. And why does science have to make sense? I mean, why does everything have to be a grid that my puny human mind can understand? Maybe there are things that or at least currently, we can't. Maybe the birds already do, and maybe they're tweeting out the science of this, and we're stupidly not paying attention to it. We're just, we're only concerned about our own affairs. Just to mention, in the book, in Mescalito, so I met Peter Rowan. So I realized bluegrass is a niche world. Are you a bluegrass fan?
I know nothing about it, and it was really fascinating reading your book and like going down into that world a little bit and discovering. I don't know very much about it at all.
Totally cool. And I'm a music fan. I love all kinds of music and deep into the details. I started listening to bluegrass, a city kid from Queens, believe it or not, but it hooked me when I heard it. And it led me to meet Peter Rowan, again, through the writing, as this missive that takes me. It is my spaceship, the writing. And I meet Peter Rowan, who's a legend of bluegrass. And he's kind of a raconteur. He's a super fascinating guy. He's a Buddhist, but he's interested we connected on a lot of topics, Native American topics. He's written some songs that are sympathetic to that world. And he has an album called Dharma Blues, which is kind of devoted to, it's very Buddhist infused. But as we were sitting I asked him crazy questions, and at one point he said, "Am I answering your questions?" And I said, "Well, they're not answerable."
Yeah.
But, at one point we were discussing that what are the origins of music. So one of the things we're talking about is bird song, and that the human ear, I had read somewhere, can hear bird song at the farthest distance than it can anything else. And that, I would think maybe some of the reasons is where there are birds, there is life, there is water. So this is a kind of vital tool to live. And as we were having this conversation, a scrub jay alighted like right on the fence where we were, because we were sitting in an outside cafe in Sausalito. Mm-hmm. And we both just looked, and it was as if the birds saying, "You guys are onto something."
Yeah.
And all of that was magical. In many ways, Peter had a lot to do even with just the launch of a direction of reading and exploration and research. And, I was having dreams, as I say in the book, I just started to have dreams, and they were peculiar. Part of it is that, music is so deep. It's so deep in your unconscious that when you meet someone that you've known as an artist, it triggers something deep inside you. Because, think of it, music you hear at funerals, music you hear at weddings. When I'm vacuuming, I put on disco. I have music for different moods. My wife and I were here on Friday, put on Nina Simone, and we just started to cry, just beautiful song. And one of her songs, she imitates a river in her playing. It's this like rumbling, gushing river, but just so beautiful. And I think that, Peter is a man. He's a person. He's a guy. He puts on his pants one leg at a time. But when you become that, you become an icon, and you have a profound effect on people. He told me, he said, "Oh, I have a poem called Falling from the Trees." And he sent me the poem, by the way. But we kept having these synchronicitous things happening. And probably with Peter, that happens a lot. He blows people's minds and they're like, "Oh my God." It was a profound gift. It really was. And the writing of the book, which was a strange book to write. It's a very strange book to write because I was possessed with these images, dreams, and trying to convey and put this together in some kind of concise form. And I didn't want it to be a chronological, kind of biographical thing. I wanted it to be like a devotional prayer book that brought music, in this case, bluegrass. It kind of brought it into a kind of parallel focus with wisdom traditions. And somehow, Peter and I kind of seemed to connect on that. I don't know if it was successful, but that was my goal, is to elevate it to this level of it's a form of spiritual practice. And it is. When you dig into the depth of any subject matter, you dig into something that has history too, and you plumb its depths. You find things, you find history. When bluegrass, it's this composite of ragtime, of blues, of country, of Hawaiian music even, and other kinds of music that were native to this soil. And when you explore that in depth, you're really doing a kind of archaeological work. And Peter is very aware of that, and he sort of plays with that, and he knows he's the holder of the kind of folkloric tapestry. He's got a great sense of humor too, but he's aware of that. So we can laugh at it. And what was the thing? He goes, "It's not what you think it is, it's the when."
Right.
And these kind of perplexing. I told him, I said, "You put a spell on me." But again, that I don't know, being open to someone ringing a bell and setting your dreams on a different path. And it's not like this adoration of, "Oh my God, he's a rock star, I can't believe it." It's this just connecting to something that is profound. And, I wanted to bring into that writing and that kind of discovery, this integration of the earth as continuous, as the cosmos as continuous, that we are kind of connected to all of these things. It's easy to forget. Can I read something from it? Short?
Please, yes, absolutely.
So I'll read something short. And this is called The Vortex. And I think it's thematically in line with what we're talking about. And so, people might be confused because the cover of the book, if you've seen it, so you have, there's a guy who looks like Krishna, okay, who's playing a guitar, and he's leaning against a white horse. And there's Bodhi trees around him, and there's Tibetan clouds. And you have this, and there's a scrub jay, by the way, if you see the book cover. And there's a little patch of Amanita muscaria mushrooms. And some would say, well, this guy doesn't know shit about anything because this is an amalgam of everything. And I just said as I was speaking to Pat, who did the illustration, these are my ideas. Don't worry about borders. We're exploring in this. So just let's be open to how these things connect. Because someone did correct me and say Krishna is not Tibetan, and I said, yeah, okay, thank you. So this story comes from, this is a Hindu story that I kind of took. And I should say that I related I used Peter's words, his lyrics, and peppered them throughout the book, which he gave me the authorization to do that. You're not supposed to do that. But I thought that would be fun. And so I'll read it. One day, when Rama was playing with the other sons of the cowherds, his mother, Yasoda, received a report from the other boys. Rama has eaten dirt, they told her. Yasoda slapped Rama's hand, scolded him, and said, naughty boy, why have you secretly eaten dirt? Rama replied, Mother, I have not eaten dirt. They are lying. If you think they speak the truth, look at my mouth yourself. Look at my mouth, into my mouth. Open your mouth so I can see, she demanded. He opened his mouth. Peering inside his mouth, Yasoda saw trees of every kind, loams of mycorrhizal fungi that web across the earth, blue and red oceans on different planets. She saw the wind and lightning and the moon and the stars and the space beyond space. She saw how one can master their senses as well as how sentient beings could be conquered and destroyed by their senses. In Rama's gaping mouth, Yasoda saw the multiverse, beings from different realms. She saw all times and places. She beheld all nature and action and hopes. Suddenly, she remembered her own little village and her own world. Then she felt small and claustrophobic. Confused and frightened, her mind began racing. Is my world small? Am I a fool? Am I imagining all of this? Is this sorcery? Or is my son a god? If he is a god, I will bow down to him. Yasoda sat down and began to breathe slowly. Many days passed, then decades, then eons. 1,000,000 universes passed into oblivion. 1,000,000,000 universes were born. Still sitting, tears rolling down her face, Yasoda thought to herself, I now understand that I cannot fathom what I have seen. But she wasn't afraid any longer. I can be tricked by false beliefs such as I and you. I realized that all sentience is connected. Not just sentience, all universes are connected, interwoven and a part of each other. When Yasoda had come to this understanding, she lost the memory of what had just previously occurred. She took Rama in her arms, hugging and kissing him, saying, I love you so much, my sweet little boy. And so, part of what inspired that is, out of Peter's mouth came, these kind of worlds and these, as you can tell, you've read parts of it, that he's very poetic and he has a great way of just kind of telling the stories and taking bluegrass and putting it on this cosmological level, which is cool, which is really where I wanted to go to. I said to him, how did it feel to, I heard an interview he did, and someone asked him, what was it like to leave a bluegrass band and play with a psychedelic band or something like that? And then Peter said, what could be more psychedelic than bluegrass? And, if you puff a little weed and you listen closely and you hear the intricacies, you hear all of this going on, it takes you on a journey. You have to get yourself into a mindset to allow access. So anyway, yeah, I would never write a book like this again. On some level, it could seem like I'm kissing Peter's ass like tremendously. I did want to give him, I wanted to place a gift at the feet of the master.
Mm-hmm.
There's something of that. But there was something else afoot as well, which was the profound effect that, speaking to him and sharing poems and stories, conversation that it had. And that kind of thing only happens once. I've interviewed a lot of people, and that just didn't happen to the same extent. So
Yeah.
I don't see that happening again.
Thank you so much for all of that.
Thank you.
Yeah, reading your book was, as you were talking about, kind of bringing together all of these worlds that don't seem to connect at first, but you do weave them together. And I understood as well as I could as I was reading.
Thank
And
you.
I can't help but, I'm still struck by the language that you used when you were beginning to talk about it, that you were possessed by these, dreams and visions and this experience that you were having with him that on some level doesn't make any sense, right? Or why,
Yeah.
what is this? What is this otherworldly, or not even otherworldly, but certainly outside of normal consensus reality thing happening beneath the surface? And how often do we just not take those things seriously? That do we put them aside and say, I don't know what the hell's going on, but I can't talk about that. I can't talk about these
Right.
dreams and visions. And what does Tibetan Buddhism have to do with, with bluegrass? And of
Right.
course he brought that aspect in as well. But that's one of my heart songs, is taking that stuff seriously, taking it seriously, because it is this dimension of life that, in the same way that a tree is a tree for a long time, and then suddenly you look at it and it's animate,
Right.
that it's this world revealed, that taking these things seriously does the same thing. It's a world revealed, and how poor we are to not have access to that world. It's just so rich to be in that world and take it seriously and have access to it. And as I was reading what you wrote, I noticed your language as well. It was this is explosive. It's volcanic. It was so, the experience you were having was so visceral. And I know what that's like, even if it's difficult for me to describe so that other people can truly understand it. I know what it's like to have those experiences that are oh, I'm coming out of my skin. Something is happening that is not normal, that is not usual.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I'm going to read something from you.
Mm.
And, and this is now, it's like we talked about it before we, both started writing. I see that we are billions of tiny creator gods. We are progenitors, alchemizing its substantial, ephemeral thought into concrete material form. We grind rock into powder and mix it with animal fat and smear it onto cave walls to paint the images that flicker behind our eyelids. We dance and drum and adorn ourselves with bones and sticks and leaves and halos of flowers and tattoos of sickle moons on our foreheads and elegance hats and woven shawls. And we spend hours embroidering tiny scenes onto a piece of denim to patch the holes in the knees of our jeans. I just love, I love these. I connected so much with what you were writing, and I felt like we were after the same thing. And it's especially true, you'll find, really more so, because Mescalito is not it's a swirling, it's a swirling time loops. These are not,
Mm.
it's not a novel.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like interviews that are interspersed with kind of wisdom tradition, little tidbits of wisdom tradition with my dreams and so on. But your book, Earth Love Story, and my book that's coming out, it's For All We Know. I mean, they
Mm.
could be companion pieces to each other. You could read them really side by side. I didn't want to, I've asked you, you've read a number of things. I just felt like I can't put that on you, but I'll certainly get you an early copy
Yeah, I would
to
love
read. And
that.
I think you'll see this. I think you will. And I think it will resonate. I loved your language. I loved the poetry of the writing. And you have another gift, which is you have a great voice.
Mm.
So you can. I've read my stuff before, and then I'm like, oh, it sounds terrible. But do you have a radio background or something?
No, I don't at all. And thank you so much for all of that. Like anytime somebody reads something that I wrote, I feel like I've won the lottery or something. It's so
I know what you
generous.
mean.
And yeah, thank you. Thank you. No, not at all. I don't have any background in this whatsoever. Every step of the way has been utter terror and not knowing what the hell I'm doing and figuring it out and like shoestringing it together. And so
Right.
I'm glad that it comes across as good production value. I had to figure out, I live in a masonry dome, which
Mm.
is not great for audio recording. So I had to
Acoustics.
figure out all these things to do. But I want to, I just want to say, you were talking about this incredible connection with Peter Rowan and how unexpected that was and all of the things that happened. I think that there's a mini version of that happening. As you said, like the writing is a vehicle for you to talk to people. That's what this podcast has
Hmm.
been, is just this
Yeah.
vehicle to have these conversations. And I have no idea how we even know each other, but
Yeah.
I saw, at
Instagram.
some point, yeah, Instagram came up and I was watching your book, your book kind of being promoted. And I was instantly kind of entranced by the name of the book. I didn't know
Mm.
what that meant, but there was something about it. And then when I read what you wrote, I had the same experience. I was like, oh, we're talking about the same stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there's all these common threads. There's, Tibetan Buddhism and other wisdom traditions and being possessed by something that just has to
Hmm.
come out a certain way. And
Hmm.
of course, the phenomenon, ufology. But
Hmm.
I didn't really even know about any of that until, I don't know, not very long. Like, I think
Me too.
after I asked you to be on the podcast, I discovered all of that. I didn't know really that any of
Mm.
that was there. So I love it. I love the mystery. I love how these connections happen and how unexpected they are. I mean, to me, that feels like the web, right? That feels like the
Hmm.
the the web of connection that we're talking about as a real alive thing. And how, again, like poor would we be if these magical connections didn't happen? It makes life
Hmm.
worth it to me. If life was rational materialism, I don't think I would have survived to be. I mean, I'm like 4% kidding, but mostly I'm telling the God's honest truth. Like, I don't know if I would have made it because
Yeah.
this is like life like this is so
Yeah.
extraordinary and beautiful. Yeah.
Making this kind of connection in a kind of random way,
Mm-hmm.
just as how did I get to Peter Rowan? So through doing interviews with so my friend Carlos Pinto has an art studio. He's Guatemalan. He introduced me to, there's a guy, Ernie Panacoli, who's a hip hop photographer.
Mm-hmm.
He's photographed, the biggest names in hip hop. He grew up in Brooklyn, and I think he was simpatico to, some of the hip hop guys, and he recognized them and they saw each other. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
He's half Cree. And I was in Pinto's studio, and I see he has lots of work, and I'm going to send you a picture of what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
But he has all this work and portraits and things. Some of it's stacked and hidden. And I said, that's that one right there, the one in back there. Pulls it out. Because that's Ernie Panacoli. You don't know who he is? And I said, no, I don't know who he is. I wound up speaking to Ernie. We had a great conversation. I did an interview with him. Then I went out with Pinto to deliver the portrait to Ernie. We delivered this, which was very moving to him. And Ernie calls me up and says, there's this woman, Mike, I think I can trust you. I want you, are you interested in talking to, she's a Tibetan singer. Would you be interested in talking to her? Of course, he was being very protective. So he introduced me to this woman, Yongchen Lamo, who's become a dear friend. And Yongchen is one of a kind. It's this ethereal, yes, she's drawing from Tibetan music traditions, but it's something other because she'll play with different kinds of ensembles, a Russian piano player, flamenco guitars. It's different. She's on Peter Gabriel's label. She even played some bluegrass. And so when I interviewed her, I said, "Oh, I saw that you played with Peter Rowan. I'm a big fan of Peter." She said, "Do you want to meet him? Do you want to talk to him?" That's what launched that.
Wow.
So from this, seeing a portrait in the back to this whole thing, and then to me, that's all magical. And I feel incredibly grateful to Peter. It wasn't just a project, and it's not like we're, the best pals. That's not, I have a great fondness for him. I have a love for him. And I think there's a kind of mutual artistic respect for each other. But man, like this, it's just one of these magical where we allowed, we listened, we heard the echo, we heard the ding on the wall, and we followed it into the woods. The deer came out, and we followed the deer into the woods, and here we are on a journey. So I agree with you. I think it's, while I know I can be small in some ways and, angry sometimes and pissed off at that. And, I try to be conscious of that and, try not to live in that world, but after all, we're human. But if we can take that clutter out of our mind and listen, there's birdsong, there's beauty, there's magic happening to be attentive to.
Stunning, beautiful, perfection. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you for, taking the time. I know it's, these things aren't easy to do. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. And I would really love to have you back on when your next book is published. And I'd love to read it and talk about it
certainly,
as more and more people are going to want. I think people are really going to need a very grounded kind of way to access, like you were saying, a framework like that Kripal gives, something to access the really unsettling mystery that's unfolding publicly now. And I hear you, like whatever public disclosure is, or however that looks, is just this one small, not very interesting, but necessary and also kind of bizarre and amazing thing that's happening. But as that happens, and as these things are revealed to people who want to know, it's great to have, some sort of guide and framework. So yeah, I would love for you to come back. Well,
thank you. And I hope it adds something to the openness and curiosity. Jeff Kripal wrote a blurb for it. Diana Pasulka, who I love, also wrote a blurb. You will certainly get an early copy. I think maybe towards the end of the year. We're now in the production phase. Wonderful. It's Loyola University Press. So I'll certainly let you know, but let's keep the lines of communication open.
Thank you so much to Mike for our beautiful conversation. You can hear us continue to talk about disclosure, the phenomena, turning dreams and vision into religion, and more by joining Patreon at patreon.com/Robin Lassiter. Thank you, as always, to Morgan Jenks for our beautiful soundscapes. And if you'd like to book a one-on-one session with me, please visit honeyheart.org.